Hi, I'm Ben Gowland. I'm going to be talking today about how general practice can move forward from where it is, and specifically how your practice can move forward from where you are. Now, I'm going to start off by talking about a book that's been really helpful to me. It's called What Got You Here Won't Get You There by a guy called Marshall Goldsmith. Now, a few years ago, I was working in a GP federation. Federation wasn't that big. We had maybe 20 staff. We ran a series of different schemes. We had a community elderly care consultant scheme, we had a practice care scheme. We had regular locality meetings. We had 4 localities. They met every month. I'd go to all of those meetings. And the way that I worked in that federation was basically I would sort of drive everything, make sure all the actions happened. If someone came and said, "Oh well, I can't produce this document or this business case," then generally I just step in and make it happen. So a lot of it was focused on what I was doing and my own sort of the way that I worked. But then CCGs came along, and the CCG was very different to the federation. It was different because it was much bigger. So even though we were a big federation of 70 practices, because when the CCG came along, suddenly our budget had gone from a couple of million to over 600 million. We went from 20 staff to 200 staff. And what I found was the behaviours and the way that I'd worked that had been successful in the federation. And in fact, historically throughout my career in hospitals and in other places, suddenly weren't the skills that I needed in my new role, because it was just too big. There was just too much to be done, and I couldn't do everything. And what I had to learn to do was to delegate to other people, not just give them work, but also make sure that they had the support they needed in doing that work. And I had to focus a lot of my time on communicating and explaining what we were doing and why we were doing it. And that is the essence really of Marshall Goldsmith's book. Because essentially he says that phenomenon isn't peculiar to me, but that is common. So when, despite a certain set of behaviours being successful for a long time, but when the environment significantly changes, that different skills are needed for people to continue to be successful. So what does that mean for general practice? Well, the world in general practice has changed significantly in the last 10 years. So having been stable for 60 years from the inception of the NHS, in the last 10 years, we've seen the world turn upside down. So we've seen it with the workload pressures, the workforce pressures, the financial pressures. The whole operating environment is much more stretched and much more difficult for general practice now than it ever was before. And what that means is that different behaviours are needed now for general practice than historically it's needed. So if we think about what were the behaviours that general practice has traditionally used to be successful, well, GPs generally have done everything. So GPs did all the clinical work, they did most of the things that needed doing, and it's only relatively recently that even nurses have started to be used by practices to do different things. I know there's exceptions around the country, but as a sort of general principle. When it did get busier, when things did get more pressured, then the response generally was GPs would just work harder to absorb that pressure as it arrived. The focus of GPs historically has been within their own practice. So the thing that matters most is what's going on within their practice, and that's been the primary focus of the effort and attention of the GPs. And a strategy that's worked well historically for general practice has been this idea of following the crowd. So as long as a practice does what the other practices are doing, it's going to be okay, because that was a tried and tested technique that general practice used. But now that the world's changed and the pressures are much greater for general practice, then different behaviours are needed. So what it needs to move forward from where it is now is a different set of behaviours from those that were used historically. So a good example is, instead of GPs doing everything, then increasingly it's important for GPs to actually delegate and let go of some of the things that historically they've always done. So, and a really good example of that is this whole workflow optimization piece, whereby GPs found, so a guy called Jonathan Sargent, working with one of his admin staff down in Brighton, that they worked out, well, actually, of all this post and all these letters that we get, which ones do I actually need to see myself, and which could we agree a protocol so that you can manage that post on my behalf? And they found a way of making up to 80% of the post is able to be managed by the admin team, and the GP doesn't need to see it. And that's a scheme now that's been rolled out across the country as part of the Releasing Time for Care programme. Equally, working harder is no longer really an option for GPs who are already at breaking point. And so what's needed and what's been more successful is where GPs then coach and empower other professionals to take on parts, particularly of their clinical work, so that the overall workload is more manageable. I was working with a practice down in Sussex, and they introduced a paramedic to carry out some of the visits on behalf of the GPs. That freed up time for the GPs, but the other thing they talked about was just this sort of, when they'd always had this fear of a call coming in late in the afternoon to make a difficult day unmanageable, that pressure being taken away, they found really helpful. But they didn't just say, right, to the paramedic, right, you go and do the visits. What they would do is they would take the call. When the call came in, they would be the ones who agreed that a visit was needed. They then talked to the paramedic before she went out to see the patient. When the paramedic was with the patient, she would then ring the GP and agree with the GP what she was going to do and the plan. And so this sort of coaching from the GP and the support that they provided really enabled that paramedic to thrive in that environment. Another key difference is a move away from, so instead of focusing on the practice, that partnerships are increasingly becoming a key part of what is making the practices who are thriving in the current environment different from the ones who are not. They're sort of having an outward focus rather than only an inward focus. I was working with a different practice, and they were struggling with sort of partner retention and just that ability to cope, as many practices are. And what they did was they built a partnership with the local community trust so that they could both access some of their back office and corporate functions and some of the leadership support that they felt they needed as a practice, but also could access some of the different staff groups that the community trust employed to support them with some of the workload. And it's that partnership with the community trust that really has enabled that practice to go on and continue to be successful, when I think without that they really would have struggled. And the other piece, I guess, we're seeing increasingly is that those who are embracing new ways of working early are the ones who are reaping the maximum benefits. I mean, you'll all have heard of GP at Hand and the whole what's happening in London. So GP at Hand offer video consultations, and what's happening is patients from around London, particularly young patients, are deregistering with their home practice and registering for basically virtual consultations with GP at Hand, and that's led to a massive growth in their numbers. They've grown 20,000 in the first 4 months, and they continue to grow. So that has been very disruptive there. And of course, the response from other parts of the countries to say, I'm glad that's not us, or I hope it doesn't come here, or is it for practices to say, well, look, what can we do? What services can we offer to our patients? Could we embrace that type of technology so that even if GP at hand did come and set up here, there'd be no reason for our patients to leave? So just simply doing what everyone else is doing, waiting until other people have tried things out, isn't necessarily going to be a behaviour that's going to work for practices moving forward into the future. Now, I can almost hear some of you listening to this thinking, well, hold on a second. Whose responsibility is it to sort out the problems that are happening in general practice? And why am I having to change what I do when it's not my fault that the situation that all general practice is in is there? Why am I the one who's having to do something differently? I want to talk in response to that about a concept that was first introduced in what's quite an old book now. It's a book by Stephen Covey. It's called The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And in his first habit, he talks about this idea of a circle of control and a circle of influence. So basically, if you think about, and just adapted it slightly, so if you think about 3 spheres of control. So in the middle, you've got those things that you can control. That's your behaviour, your actions, what happens in your practice, the things that you do. They're things that are directly in your control. Then there's things that are in your influence. So that's other people's actions, other people's behaviours, other practices, other organisations in your local community. You can take steps that can actually influence those things. But then there are a set of things that are outside of your control. So that might be the weather, or Iran's nuclear program, or what Jeremy Hunt says or does, or what the government decides is next for general practice. Those things are outside of your control. So when you're thinking about the injustice and the unfairness of the situation that general practice is in, remember that that is something that essentially is outside of your control. And so I know it's difficult, but the really important thing for you to do if you want to thrive is to let that go. And I know that's much easier said than done, but it's a really important step in terms of thinking, okay, I'm not going to focus my energy on getting angry about the situation that general practice is in, because I can't control that. And it makes me reactive. But instead I'm going to be proactive. I'm going to focus on the things that I can control and the things that I can influence. Because the reality is there aren't enough GPs. There are never going to be enough GPs. Demand's going to keep on rising, and funding is not going to keep up with the demand. So there's a point at which we need to accept the new environment that general practice is operating in, and then think about, what can I do within my own control to actually change that? So if I think that the things that I've historically done aren't the things that I'm going to need to do to move forward, and that I want to control, I want to focus on those things that I can control rather than things that are outside of my control, what's the plan? What's the plan for me? What's the plan for my practice? Now, I talk to practices quite a lot about this. I say, okay, what's your plan? What's your sort of 3-year plan for the practice? Where is it that you're going? And you get that kind of moment, don't you, where the partners are kind of either looking under the table or sort of fumbling around saying, oh, I think the practice manager's got a plan. I'm sure it's on her shelf somewhere. So, but for some practices do have a plan, and that plan is generally we just want to get out of the difficult situation that we're in. I want to share with you this quote from Dalai Lama. And this is what he says. He says, moving towards better rather than moving away from bad is an attitude of embracing life rather than rejecting it. And there are two types of goals that we can have. There are the moving away from bad goals, the moving away goals, and there are the moving towards better types of goals. If you think about, people want jobs, new jobs for different reasons. The moving away goal is, I just hate my current job. So the reason I want a new job is so that I can get away from the fact that my current job is so bad. Or I really want to take up this job because it looks really exciting. It really feels I can fulfill my potential in that role, and that's a towards goal. For general practice and for practices, there are different. Those types of goals equally apply. So away from goals for general practice are, I want to get out of the situation that I'm in, or I just want to hold on for a few more years so I can retire, or this came up from a conversation I was having with a GP who runs a resilience course for GPs. And after she'd done the course, she was talking to a GP, and she said, what impact has the course had? And they said, I can't tell you how much of an impact it's had. I'm now able, on my drive home from the surgery, to do that without crying. Whereas every day I've just been crying on the way home. And so the situation is really difficult, and it's really tempting to think for practice, okay, what we need to do is just stop things being so bad. But the reason that away from goals aren't great is because it focuses our energy the whole time on those things that are bad, and it can be demoralizing and dispiriting. And then when things do start to get slightly better, what we do is we lose the momentum for making change because things aren't as bad anymore, so why are we going to keep on doing it? Whereas there are really positive towards goals that practices can have. So I want to improve the health of my local population. I want to leave a positive legacy for future generations of GPs. I want GPs to be operating right at the very top of their training, doing what only GPs can be doing. And the point about towards goals is that they create energy for change that's positive, because you're focusing on the good things that you're doing, not the bad things that you're leaving behind, and that they're sustainable over a longer period because you know where you're going, and and it energizes you to keep making changes after the initial parts of the plan have been started. Okay, so I understand that I need to do things differently, that I need to focus on the things that are in my control, and I need to have towards goals, not away from goals. What is the plan going to be then? Okay, so I'm lucky enough, as many of you know, to host the General Practice podcast, and I get to talk to different people who are doing different things. And so what I've got is a few examples of places that have created a plan that's working for them in the current environment. Now, I'm not saying these are the right answers for everyone. I'm saying they're examples of plans for you to think about when creating your own plan that's right for your own context. So our health partnership is a super practice, many of you know, in Birmingham. So originally there were 32 practices serving a population of 280,000, and they were coming together saying, well, we've got this problem with general practice. We want to work out how we can operate together to make general practice better for us. And their underpinning belief was in locally autonomous, partner-based general practice. That was a principle they weren't prepared to compromise on. And says, how can we build on that, yet support each other in what we're doing? And they decided what they would do would be to create a shared management structure, and for that to be as effective as it could be, that what they would do is dissolve their individual partnerships and create one new partnership and create what is effectively a super practice. And that what they did through that was reduce costs for the practice, so they have a single accountancy function rather than having 38 separate accountancy functions. There are 38 practices now. They've grown since they first started. They have a single CQC registration, and they have a team that supports quality improvement across all of the practices who are part of the super practice. They have a relationship with Lantern, so that they have a bank for salaried and locum GPs that can work across the different practices to help them tackle the staffing issues that they face. They've got headroom in that central management team to think about the future, think about what they need to do differently, and to be able to implement changes across the different practices as new ideas come along. And they also, by working together as one entity, have a much stronger voice for general practice in the system discussions about integrated care. So another example is Thistlemore Medical Centre in Peterborough. I don't know if you know Peterborough. Peterborough has a high migrant population. It has a lot of agriculture, and there's a big Amazon factory there. And as a result, a lot of Eastern Europeans have come and settled in Peterborough, and many don't speak only very limited English or no English at all. Now, that practice started with a vision which was about working as a team and delivering healthcare by the most appropriately trained professional. So that might sound simple, but what they're really talking about is making sure that everyone in the team can do the maximum amount that they're able to do. And what they do is they have healthcare assistants who are recruited from the local community, so who speak Russian or Latvian or Polish or Lithuanian, and they take the patient into the consulting room, they take the history, they take simple investigations like blood pressures, and then the GP comes in and they present the patient to the GP. The GP then takes over, completes any parts of the history, makes any decisions, makes any referrals, and then leaves the healthcare assistant to enact the plan that's been agreed and to help the patient back out of the consulting room and start over with the next one. In the meantime, the GP goes into a different consulting room where there's another healthcare assistant who's done the exact same thing, who then presents their patient to the GP. And the GPs work across two rooms. And it's not just GPs, so they've got paramedics and nurse practitioners who also work with healthcare assistants. Because of the nature of the population, they found having appointment systems didn't work, so they have it completely open access. They'll tell me sometimes up to 300 patients a day. And the practice is growing at a tremendous rate. It grows at between 1,000 and 2,000 patients a year. They're now up to 24,000 patients, and they think they'll be up to 30,000 in the next 3 or 4 years. And the last example that I'd mention is Beacon Medical Group in Plymouth, again, who some of you will have heard of. It was formed only 4 years ago, in 2014. 3 surgeries merged, forming a population of 33,000. When they merged, they didn't just keep going as they were. What they did was they split the on-the-day and the routine work. They created a team that was GP-led with practice pharmacists, advanced paramedic practitioners, nurse practitioners working with the GPs to manage the urgent on-the-day work, and that freed up time for the other GPs to both spend more time with the routine patients and to pursue other services. They also were able to build relationships, particularly with dermatologists and orthopaedic surgeons, and they're able to set up dermatology service, MSK services, and other types of services that they were able to offer both, so to offer a better service to their patient and support the practice financially. And they're one of the rapid test sites for the primary care home, so that the whole building on the new models of care is something that's based around their practice and their population. Now, like I say, those examples are just examples. They're not necessarily the ones that are right for you. But the world has changed for general practice. It's no longer going to be the situation where the behaviours that have traditionally worked for general practice are the ones that are going to work in the future. The things that got general practice here aren't going to be the things that get general practice into a new and thriving future. And so for GPs and for practices, the best course of action is to focus on the things that are within your own sphere of control. Don't waste energy on things that you can't control. Create a plan. Make sure it's a plan that's towards a bright new future, not one that's simply away from bad. And just to finish, a reminder that you don't have to compromise your principles in doing this. So all those examples that I gave, they're very clear about what their founding principles were, whether that's locally autonomous based partner-led GP practice, or whether it's about people being able to operate at the top of their skill set. Whatever their principles are, they stuck to those principles. And so equally, you must do that. It's not about compromising your principles, it's about sticking to your principles, but at the same time, not being afraid to be different. Because being different is one of the things that to me seems like it's working best. Hope you found that useful. There's a few references there if you want to follow up any of the things that I've been talking about. And just as a final thing to say, we've got Thistlemore Medical Centre. Neil Moder's coming on the podcast in a couple of weeks' time, so do listen out for that. Thanks very much.